What do you do when you come across a speaker that's both deeply engrossing on Vaughn Williams' orchestral Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis and enthralling on Samantha Fish's blues rocker Killer Be Kind? My first thought was, buy it. However, before we jump to hasty conclusions, let's do a full review of the Paradigm Persona 5F speakers. This one has been a surprise, but first a few details about what we're talking about so that you can determine if the Persona 5F is even relevant to your finances and environment. We'll start with a product overview. The Paradigm Persona 5F is a 5-driver, 3-way, floor-standing speaker of slightly larger dimensions than some of the other speakers that I'm covering in this series, which goes from $10,000 to $20,000 a pair. The Persona 5F is 46.5 inches tall, 17 inches deep, and 9.5 inches wide, if that helps. In one of 5 standard finishes, they're priced at $18,000 per pair. Our review sample came in the standard Aria blue paint, which was paired with a silver front panel and silver woofers. I mention all this because Paradigm offers a huge range of customization options as well as a variety of standard combinations. For example, if the silver front panel and drivers aren't to your liking, you can choose standard black paint with black drivers and either a silver or black front panel for no extra charge. There are more combinations than that. Or you can mix and match cabinet, metalwork, mid and tweeter lens, and woofer colors to your heart's content. And there are 18 optional paint colors. Some of these options increase the price, but very few, if any, manufacturers at this price level offer a comparable degree of customization. Such are the advantages of Paradigm owning its own Canadian factory with paint shop. Now, Martha Stewart notwithstanding, the 5F features a 1-inch beryllium dome tweeter and a 7-inch beryllium mid-range. Yes, the mid-range is beryllium, specifically a beryllium foil surface, as with most other drivers that are called beryllium. Both the tweeter and the mid use a perforated phase aligning lens and a finite element analysis pole piece design. The 3 woofers are 7-inch drivers with high excursion surrounds in a bottom ported cabinet. Weight is 95 pounds per speaker. Average impedance is 8 ohms, and sensitivity is a claimed 93 dB at 1 watt at 1 meter, which is higher than normal. This should allow for users to choose slightly lower powered power amps, which opens up many tube designs and some pure Class A designs as possible options. A 93 dB sensitivity speaker with a 50 watt per channel amp should have the same SPL capability as a typical 87 dB sensitivity speaker with a 200 watt per channel. Things are never so simple, but this still seems like a plus to us. As always, we caution that you can't reason, or at least I can't reason, from technical details to sound quality, so let's turn our attention to that. All right, Paradigm makes a big deal out of their partnership with the Canadian National Research Council, which has a long history of fundamental research into audio performance and particularly speaker design. The audio division of the NRC was led by Floyd Toole for a while, and his work, among that of others, improved the understanding of how loudspeakers for music really function. As with most scientific progress, it took a while to integrate these learnings into workable speaker designs. I'll admit that some of the early attempts made me a little gun-shy coming into this review because Paradigm likes NRC science, and I was worried about too much rule following and not enough music making. I shouldn't have worried. The Persona 5F is simply an outstanding speaker. What I found especially interesting as I explored a bevy of test tracks is that the 5F succeeds largely on the grounds of musical consonance or rightness. It somehow, I say more about how in a bit, gets to the essence of what creates a connection between music and listener. If it has weaknesses, and it does, these come mainly in a few analytical factors that reviewers like me can name, but which often don't matter that much when musical life and soul and beauty are on display. A few examples may help flesh this meta idea out. Starting with the high-res reissue of Simon & Garfunkel's Bookends, I noted the impressive clarity that the 5F brings to what is a highly produced, complex mix. The clarity isn't a frequency balance thing. It's a matter of presenting each musician as if spotlit, so that the full grandeur of each song comes through. At the same time, the strength of the spotlighting varies from instrument to instrument to create a sense of balance. Not equal weighting, but a balanced musical presentation. The air around and dimensionality of each performer was much more like a good live performance in a small venue. Turning to Rory Block's new Positively 4th Street album of Dylan covers, I heard a kind of classic recording balance. I've said before that good speakers seem to draw your attention to recording differences more than speaker distortions, and I was beginning to sense some of that here. Rory is an acoustic roots guitar virtuoso, but here she's presented delivering songs as songs, with just enough pyrotechnic material to make you clear that this is a cover, not a copy. The impressive thing with the 5F is how, despite the conservative recording style, Rory's guitar solos are so dynamically contrasty. Now, not wanting to get locked into 1960s styles, I put on Francine 13's Queen Mary. What I said above about instruments getting their own space held true, but I also got a very good rendition of nearly subterranean synthesizers which just seemed to come up from the floor a bit like monsters of the deep. The 5F is mostly not a blurry, sludgy, compressed, noisy speaker, and it helps you realize how often speakers don't quite achieve this level of transparency. The other thing on Queen Mary is the way some purely synthesized effects are presented in space. There are some sort of Star Trek laser cannon sounds in the middle of the track, and no joke, they appeared to be moving in space as if fired toward me, reaching from the speaker plane across the room and past my head. I don't have a live music reference for this, so I don't know whether it's accurate, of course, but it seemed impressive and maybe appropriate. Switching gears completely, I put on the aforementioned Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, a Vaughn Williams classic that if you live outside England isn't hopelessly overplayed. The version I used was with Elder and the Halle Orchestra. Vaughn Williams knew a thing or two about melody, and this is a very good recording, but almost always these orchestral pieces have something that manages to make the violins unnaturally edgy and strident. I heard less of that here, a sense that was repeated on Daniel Trifonoff's Silver Age, a classical piano recording. The 5F delivers gentleness when the recording features it, and clarity when that's the ticket, and power when that's called for. Miles Davis's In a Silent Way reinforced this point. The musicians are rendered like you can hear each mic feed individually, because maybe that's how it was recorded, and yet the tone and dynamic of McLaughlin's guitar or Zawinul's piano seems more naturally real and less like a simulation of real. The 5F helps you realize how often there's an undercurrent of artificiality lurking in the background of playback systems. Okay, earlier I promised a theory of what makes the 5F so vivid and convincing. It starts with the impressive ability of the 5F to get the image mostly off the speakers and present it richly on a virtual stage. Lots of speakers do something like this, but most of them have limitations to how this is done. So does the 5F, but the limitations are smaller in degree than most box speakers. The 5F image stretches wider than some, but the revelatory element comes down to three things. First, the 5F image, when it appears between the speakers, seems to have the front of the virtual stage on the same plane as the speakers. This means images placed far left or far right appear to be more of a piece than the stage does with the speakers when there's a front-to-back disconnect between the lateral images and the central stage. Second, the 5F image conjures more depth than most speakers. So, while the front of the stage is a bit farther forward than with many speakers, the rear of the stage is farther back. This seems more real or less squished. Third, the 5F doesn't have an obvious cap to image height that seems aligned with the tops of the speakers. Soundstage height shouldn't be vast, in contrast with sound space height. But it's odd to have the stage sliced in two at maybe 40 inches off the floor. The 5F doesn't do that, and hence doesn't distract as much as some speakers in this area. Now, to the key point. There's psychoacoustic work that says your ear-brain has an easier time distinguishing different sounds when the sounds are arrayed in space rather than all seeming to come from the same area. If you reflect back on what I've said about the 5F spotlighting performers, you can see why it might be good at this without resorting to frequency manipulation. The theory is really a so what. The point is that the Persona 5F does seemingly desirable things in terms of vividness and naturalness. And even more, the 5F's desirable qualities generate a level of engagement with the music that's top-notch. Another way of saying this is that the 5F sounds good on more recordings than most speakers. We'll say a little bit more about this in a second. Given the variable quality of recordings, that's a real advantage. Now let's talk about voicing. We need to review the voicing of these speakers because many listeners place a high priority on these factors. Let's start with mid-bass. The 5F has very slightly elevated mid-bass. This is what many people want, again, based on research. They may want more boost here, in fact, than the 5F offers. Remember, however, that this factor will also be greatly affected by room characteristics. I would say that the 5F has a smidge less definition in this region than some competitors, but note that research indicates that the ear is a little less sensitive to resonances or timing errors below 100 Hz than elsewhere. And again, room acoustics are a big factor here. Next, let's talk about low bass. The 5F goes down to the mid-30 Hz range with pretty flat output in my listening and my measurements. I found it very satisfying on electronic music that can go below 40 Hz, though I wouldn't say it is the best speaker in this department if that's your number one concern. Again, before you freak out about this range, you have to be sure you have a room that is sized and constructed to deliver these frequencies. Then let's talk about treble balance. The 5F sounds pretty flat in the upper mid-range and lower treble, but that's an average observation. Lots of listening suggests a small dip in the upper mids, followed by a rise in the mid-treble. Measurements confirm this. This balance can be flattering on a lot of well-recorded music, but some treble can sound a little too prominent. This is especially the case with digital recordings from, say, 1980 to 2000 or so. To be more specific, comparing Rush's Permanent Waves from 1980 to The Cure's Faith from 1981 shows that not all older recordings are compressed or strident when presented with flat to rising treble, but some are, and unfortunately Rush falls into this category. My summary is that the 5F treble has deviations that are artfully judged for well-recorded music and listeners who favor resolution and detail. This, however, is not the speaker for listeners who want soft, dark treble, nor is it the speaker for listeners who favor primarily older digital recordings. Then there's overall frequency balance. The 5F is quite linear from bass to lower treble, meaning that bass, mid-range, and treble all sound proportional. There's a slight bass rise, or if you prefer this language, a slight downward tilt to the basic frequency balance, coupled with some extra sparkle up top, above 6 kHz. Some people have described this as a bottom-up balance to indicate small deviations that almost subconsciously favor the lower range when discussing the core musical fundamentals from 40 Hz to 4 kHz. Again, this is on good recordings. The older modern stuff that features sound imposed by the engineer will sound, well, however that flavor really sounds, with potentially some added brightness, which can be distressing with distorted recordings. Next, let's talk about the power band. An often overlooked aspect of voicing is the way a component handles the range from about 200 to 500 Hz. This is where many instruments have their fundamental tones, yes, but probably more important is this is where the rhythm section of a lot of rock, pop, and jazz gets things done. Think about the fact that rack toms are tuned in this band, and it may help reveal the importance of how components work here. In the event, the 5F does a very nice job in this region, which may be why it seems so vivid and alive. It's possible that the use of 3 woofers with varying floor bounce cancellation frequencies helps with this. Sound staging. I've already discussed this, but to summarize, the 5F is a category leader in this department. The stage of the 5F is bigger than the miniaturized stage we've come to expect with standard stereo, but more importantly, it's simply more coherently executed. Staging, like most things in music, isn't a game of the mostest, it is a game of believability, which is where the 5F succeeds. It isn't an MBL or a Linkwitz, but it comes much closer than I expected. All right, let's summarize. I've enjoyed the first several reviews in this series because the $10,000 to $20,000 price range seems to give designers a chance to do many things well. The The Paradigm Persona 5F reinforces this idea. Of the speakers in this price range, the Persona 5F surprised and delighted me by being the most musically engaging and among the most musically engaging speakers I've heard. You can get more analytical sound or more polite sound, but my sense is that it might take at least twice the cash to get speakers that are better at the vividness the Persona 5F does so well. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Paradigm Persona 5F speakers. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.